You know the old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, geographers like Dean and myself think about maps in the same way, right? Maps as being pictures worth 1,000 words and sometimes more, depending on what they show. Since we started spending time on the Georgia coast, and Dean has spent a lot more time, it's also worth saying that Ricky, sitting right there, is involved in this, and Jill up there is involved in this. There's a large kind of emerging group of us, despite the fact that there are only two names right there. We started to take some pictures and we started to think about sustainability in ways that I don't think oftentimes aligns with the way in which sustainability gets talked about. One of the main points I want to make today is a fairly common hypothesis or trope within political ecology, and that is that all questions of socio-ecological sustainability are fundamentally political questions. To that end, those working in political ecology, and again another kind of trope almost on the verge of cliche now, try to figure out who gains from and who pays for, who benefits from and who suffers, and in what ways from particular processes of socio-ecological change. So it's within that we're starting to think about some of the kind of questions of sustainability on the Georgia coast. As a good geographer, I have a lot of maps. I like to play that role. And just to orient us, of course, that's Georgia. That's the Georgia coast. For those of you who are not aware, that is Sapelo Island right there, where I'm mostly going to be talking about. And our starting point in this project is thinking about the ways in which sea level rise is coupled with increasing population growth to create these processes of socio-ecological change. So it's this coupled understanding of how these things are working together. And Matt Hauer, who's over there, has also been involved in some of this work with Dean. It's also worth saying. More specifically, we're interested in the interactions between how population growth, development, and varied forms of urbanization are likely to continue to promote processes of uneven spatial development and exacerbate long-standing racial inequalities within the region. As such, focusing on the dynamic processes of socio-ecological systems, not merely social or ecological processes in isolation, is important for understanding the ongoing dynamics of urbanizing and urbanization on the Georgia coast, which right now is kind of at point zero in some ways. So it's a very interesting laboratory for thinking about some of these dynamics. Now, most of the attention to the Georgia coast is oftentimes around things like this, which I know very little about. And it has to do with the kind of amazing marsh ecosystems that dominate our coast. Within Georgia's coastal zone, there are hundreds of kilometers of shoreline that wind around approximately 145,000 hectares of tidal wetlands. Wetlands that include freshwater, brackish, salt marshes, as well as tidal cypress swamps extending up numerous rivers. The area's ecological significance stems in part from the comprising nearly 1/3 of all salt marsh found along the U.S. eastern seaboard. At the same time, research is showing that seas have risen at an average rate of 2.6 millimeters per year since 1935. And this is 1 times greater than the average global rate. So there's something going on that we're starting to pick up. Recent studies estimate that seas may rise another 1/4 meter by 2030, tripling the chance of a 1 meter high flood event for Georgia before 2030. Okay, so all this suggests that this is important in all kinds of ways, and furthermore, in the lives of those vulnerable populations who are not buffered to be able to withstand these sorts of shocks. At the same time, between 2000 and 2010, Georgia's 6 coastal counties have experienced a 64,142 change in total population, which represents 14.6% increase. A paper that Dean and Matt currently have under review right now projected between 2010 and 2050, there will be another 241,000 people moved to these counties, which would represent a 47.9% increase. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. McIntosh County, which is where we're going to start scaling down to, Population change during the same period has increased by about 3,500 folks, which is an increase of 32.1%. So again, we see these processes really kind of ramping up in important ways. Now, although migration of affluent white folks to the coast since the 1920s has facilitated the loss of many waterfront properties by people of color, the population of the U.S. Coastal counties is still roughly 47.5% comprised of folks who are not identified as white folks, who are identified as minorities. And 14.2% of that is explicitly African American populations. In the U.S. South, as you can start to see on this map, specifically African Americans make up 19.8% of the population in coastal counties, extending from Virginia all the way down to Texas, which is considerably higher than the percentage of African Americans nationally, which is 13.6%. This suggests the definitive potential for non-white folks, especially African American folks in the U.S. South, to be disproportionately affected by sea level rise and the coupled dynamics of urbanization that we're trying to think about in these ways. So now I want to jump more specifically to Sapelo, and this is a map that if you've ever been, you've probably seen. It's probably the most common map floating around. It's a barrier island off of McIntosh County. More than 97% of it is publicly owned, and most of the land is managed for hunting by the Georgia DNR. However, land and facilities management responsibility over several thousand acres, especially down here, are managed between several institutions. So one of them, the one that created this map, the Sapelo Island National Estuarine Research Reserve, SINER, which an icon student currently recently got a job at, Rachel, encompasses all of the Duplin River drainage to the west of Sapelo Island and about 2,100 acres of upland and marsh at the south end of the island and along the southeastern shoreline, the back marsh. And then the world famous, I got to say that with pride, world famous UGA Marine Institute hosts research and instructional programs and holds long-term lease right down yonder on about 1,500 acres of land. So those are three of the kind of stakeholders that play a role here. But the map that actually I think the most about is this map. And this map is from this book written by Ms. Cornelia Walker Bailey. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And in part, the work that we've been doing has been in partnership with folks in the hog hammock community, and we've been kind of taking our time to get to know folks and just trying to understand a different version of the history of this island than one that often gets told. So many of the folks that live in the hog hammock community are descendants of slaves that worked on the island in the past. They call themselves saltwater Geechee, having identities that are tied to the rhythm of the surrounding tidal salt marsh. A notable piece of history that I'll just kind of take an aside to mention is that this island is the place of the earliest known Islamic text in the Americas, a 13-page document that was handwritten, including Muslim law and prayers, written in the early 19th century by a native West African named Muhammad Ali. This is its origin. The reason I bring it up is that it's at UGA. I've actually been in his presence and got neck all tingly knowing the history before I saw it. It's an amazing thing. Between 1865 and 1912, at least 15 small communities around the island were purchased and settled by former island slaves and their descendants. These are just a couple of them that you see here on Miss Cornelia's map. In 1934, however, tobacco industry magnate R.J. Reynolds purchased the majority of the island from Howard Coffin, except for 7 privately held Geechee communities. But then over 30 years of his ownership kind of pushed everyone out of these communities down to just the one, which is Hog Hammock. And this is the lone kind of community that the saltwater Geechee remain in, and they have a great kind of role to play in the stewardship and management of the private property on the island. However, the community currently faces very extreme challenges and difficulties proving land ownership, disputes regarding property taxes on the land, and essentially thinking through how to deal with lagging income opportunities among landowners. And this is all at a time when sea level has currently been realized as an additional threat to the culture, to the sustainability of these people kind of fundamentally. And so we see this kind of intersection start to become more concrete in very specific ways if we start paying attention just to recent history. So with fewer than 50 now full-time residents in Hog Hammock, community's been undergoing significant changes. And we're at a threshold point right now. So we're trying to get some benchmark data collected just so we can figure out what's going on within these urbanizing processes, these transfers of private property from descendant owners to non-descendant owners. And part of this has been kind of spurred on by the state of Georgia when they mandated that McIntosh County reassess all county property values, stating that the reassessment was long overdue. This process kind of entered into the mix a great deal of struggle, of tension. And so here you see public notices for tax delinquent properties in the local paper as kind of making much of this land publicly available to whoever can afford to buy it. And even though the McIntosh County did not ultimately raise those tax rates, the mandatory reassessment increased the property values kind of on the books. So there was a 300% increase in many properties just over a 10-15 year period, which is kind of an explosion if you think about it in the context of private property relations. So the future of these privately owned parcels and the management decisions around them has a lot to do with some of the challenges thinking about sea level rise mitigation and adaptation, right? Because in order to have a kind of the sorts of difficult conversations that communities need to have, there has to be the kind of, various kind of cohesive forms of governance that will allow that to happen. And so this is just a quick map to show kind of what's going on within Hog Hammock to get a better sense. So you can see here, essentially, the dark colored property is Geechee descendants, and then you start to see non-traditional creeping in here, and Heritage Authority, which is a quasi-hybrid state private entity that is increasingly starting to take on ownership of property essentially on behalf of the state, but it's more complicated than that, too complicated to get into right now. And it's worth saying that of the 292 properties within the community, 180 are owned by families who are Gullah Geechee, 69 by non-descendant property owners. These are outsiders, right? Folks that are starting to creep in and purchase properties at a high rate. I was on island when this fence was put up, which kind of enters in, if you will, a bit of a qualitative kind of example of the transformations that are happening on the island. This road has long been a communal thoroughfare for many communities, many community members. This off-island, wealthy white man came in and immediately put up this fence. I was there when the fence came down and the fence went back up, and I kept driving back and forth just trying to like this, trying to be casual to see what was going on with the dynamics of this one kind of issue around property management. Krista's standing, about to get hugged. This is the most interesting map that I want to show very, very quickly. And what you can see here is the number of parcels within Hog Hammock that potentially, if we think about some of the projected sea level rise, are going to be affected. So this is 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 3 feet, 205 parcels are impacted. Okay? So again, when we think about sustainability on the Georgia coast, the question of whose sustainable future are we talking about, and how can we better include some of the racial histories within these conversations to help take a broader accounting of what's going on and how these very difficult conversations can happen. Because otherwise, there will be a continued displacement of the saltwater Geechee off this island, and many people fear that the kind of we're at a point of no return in many ways. And so, it introduces a whole host of questions.
really don't want to.